Hello, this is Julie Cooper, half of the duo of Kendall and Cooper, bringing you a show about mysteries and all things related to mystery. But first, I'd like to give acknowledgement to my brother's composition, The Man in the Panama Hat, which is our theme music. And I know we have a very special guest this morning speaking with us about something Sherlockian. And with that, I'll turn it over to my partner, Wendy.
Wendy Kendall here. Hello, mystery lovers. I tend towards cozy mysteries, but enjoy them all. And speaking of spanning the mystery spectrum, we often talk about the differences between the many mystery types on the spectrum, from cozy all the way up to thriller. A writer who masters those differences can write wonderful stories across the spectrum. And our guest today is Hugh Ashton, who is just such a writer. He's authored a collection of Sherlock Holmes stories from an innovative premise that has been described as written by a skilled author who, quote, channeled Arthur Conan Doyle and writes plot lines worthy and interesting. Mr. Ashton has described what he does as, quote, making his living by picking words out of his head and arranging them in some sort of order. I'd say that's understated. In addition to the Holmes works, he's also written exciting contemporary and historical thrillers to rave reviews, and we're privileged to introduce Hugh Ashton, recently from Tokyo and now back in the UK.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, I suppose that is how I make my living. I pick words out of my head and arrange them in order, but maybe it's a little more complex than that, I suppose. But anyway, thank you very much. It's wonderful, the power of the internet to bring people together like this. I know you're on the other side of the world. And yeah, I'm just knocked out by the fact that I can be talking to you like this with no, as if we're in the same room. It's fantastic. Thank you very much for bringing me here.
It does. It feels like we're just sitting around a coffee table here, or I should say tea table.
Yeah, I am in the UK after all. Tea table, yes, please.
Well, I do want to credit the podcast cover picture, which is so intriguing, to Erwin Wong. And Hugh, can you describe for us a little bit where you are in that picture?
Sure. Erwin Wong is a fantastically skilled photographer working in the Tokyo area. He does amazing things with light. And he was doing a series of interesting foreigners living in Japan. And I thought, well, I'm an interesting foreigner, so I suggested to Erwin that he took my picture. And I suggested the scene. And the place where this photo is taken is actually the Admiral's Saloon on His Imperial Japanese Majesty's ship, the Mikasa. Now, the Mikasa was Admiral Heihachiro Togo's flagship. The Mikasa was built in the UK, and she became the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Fleet in 1905, and she helped win the Battle of Tsushima Straits against the Russians. So very, very important. And they've restored her as a museum, and we took this in the Admiral's Dining Saloon. And the Mikasa Preservation Society, of which I was a member, were very, very cooperative. And we even had a retired Rear Admiral holding one of the flashes to take these photographs.
Oh, wow.
Lovely.
So there's quite a story behind that. But thank you very much, Erwin, for allowing me to use this photograph as part of my publicity material, if you like. And many thanks also to Susie Walker, who lent me the top hat and the tailcoat.
I have to say you look very dapper in the picture as well.
Thank you very much.
Well, getting to your writing now, I just have to jump in and say I love your premise with your Sherlock stories, that Dr. Watson left unpublished stories in a bank box, and over 100 years later you were contacted because your grandmother's a relation with her maiden name as Watson. What gave you the idea to author some more Sherlock stories in Watson's voice?
Okay, well, the bank box is actually described in the Adventure of Thor Bridge, where Holmes actually does mention, Watson does mention that he has some more untold tales of Sherlock Holmes which are deposited in a bank box marked with John H. Watson, MD, late Indian Army, and they're deposited in the bank vaults of Cox and Co. of Charing Cross. That is actually mentioned in the canon in the Arthur Conan Doyle stories. So the idea of discovering the tin box is not totally original. However, it is a wonderful coincidence that my grandmother's maiden name was indeed Watson. In fact, I actually have an antique fork with J. Watson inscribed on it from that side of the family, which I think is absolutely wonderful.
Yes.
And why did I get the idea to author more stories in Watson's voice? Quite frankly, I think it's the only voice in which to tell a Sherlock story. Sherlock Holmes did one or two Sherlock Holmes stories, The Lion's Mane, Blanche Soldier, etc., which were first-person Sherlock Holmes. And they lack the mystery. Because Sherlock Holmes knows everything, he doesn't have the skill to hide things and make the story entertaining. And I think the fact that Conan Doyle actually didn't write so many non-Watson stories was an indication that he found that the Watson voice was the voice in which to write Sherlock Holmes stories. So for me, there really wasn't any argument as to what kind of format to set these stories in.
Well, there's been many Sherlock Holmes movies and TV shows that have been entertaining and have introduced the logical and deductive reasoning to new generations of fans. But is there something special in the written stories for these film fans?
Oh, absolutely. The first thing is imagination. What does Sherlock Holmes look like? Well, we've got some clues out of the written books. But if you see Benedict Cumberbatch or Johnny Lee Miller or Robert Downey Jr. or even Christopher Lee or Peter Cushing, you know what Sherlock Holmes looks like. But Sherlock Holmes is, in some ways, more of a sort of archetype than he is a real human being. So I think one of the nice things about the written stories is that you can use your imagination a lot more. Sidney Paget, who illustrated the original stories, did a very good job, I think, of bringing a Sherlock Holmes to life. But even so, there are some things where you can use your imagination. But from the plot point of view, I think what written stories bring to the table is a filter. Because if you are watching a movie or a television show, you are watching what the producer has asked the cameraman to focus on. If you're reading a story, you don't know what to focus on. What is important, what is not important. And you're seeing all this through Watson's eyes. And Watson is like us. He can see, but he does not observe, as Sherlock Holmes himself put it. You see Watson, but you do not observe. So we've got everything going on around us, but what's important? We don't know. In a movie or a TV production, the director knows what's important, and he tells the cameraman to focus on it. So it's cheating in a way. Does that make sense?
That's a really good point. I never thought of it that way. Yeah, you're right. It sort of adds to the mystery because you don't know what to focus on.
Definitely.
Very nice.
Yes, the reader has got to do the detective work for themselves instead of having it done for them.
So in that way, you're actually more engaged when you're reading.
To me, yes, definitely.
That's excellent. Well, the Victorian Age was such an exciting time because it included, at the time, great technological and scientific advancement. So what are some parts of this age that you've particularly enjoyed using in your stories?
Ooh, I suppose it's the atmospheric ones, the telegrams, the steam trains, the hansom cabs. To a large extent, yeah, that's the sort of atmospheric, the glitter of it. Behind it all, though, you've got this super rationalism. The Victorians thought of themselves, rightly or wrongly, as being very, very rational. And Sherlock Holmes, I suppose, is the epitome of that rationality. I I don't know if you saw, but on my Facebook page, I put up a video of a lecture I recently gave in London on science and fiction. And I was talking about the role of science and fiction in Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and Arthur Conan Doyle, but not the Sherlock stories, and a story of my own. And I came to the conclusion, having read these, that one of the primary functions of all of primary drivers, not functions, one of the primary drivers in all of these stories was evolution. And the idea of evolution was a very, very key concept to many Victorian writers. Now, I haven't explicitly put this in my Sherlock Holmes stories, but I think there is a thread of it going through many of them.
I see.
So it must have been an incredibly liberating thing for Victorians to realise that perhaps the world was not created in 7 days by an omnipotent creator, but that there was something more going on, something greater than a 7-day creation.
It's interesting that you talk about that because, I always think about it as the technological, but you're right, it's almost a philosophical change at that time.
Very much so. I'm lucky, actually. I live in Lichfield at the moment, which was the home of Erasmus Darwin, who was Charles Darwin's grandfather. And long before Charles published The Origin of Species, Erasmus Darwin was putting forward his theory of evolution.
Oh.
And his house is perhaps 10 minutes walk from where I'm talking to you now.
Oh, nice.
It's wonderful.
It's living history.
Definitely. It's great fun.
Well, I'm kind of glad that you mentioned your Facebook page. For anybody who hasn't visited it, you're in for a treat. You want to check that out.
Yeah, it varies. There are lots of stupid puns. There is some political ranting. And there are some great people who contribute things to it. I've got a great bunch of Facebook friends from all over the world, many different cultures, many different points of view, and they come together. And for the most part, they don't quarrel too bitterly. So it's rather lovely.
Well, I can't talk about Holmes without talking about Watson because they are inseparable and they complement each other. Watson is practically Holmes's only friend, and that character has many similarities to Arthur Conan Doyle, both of them being medical men and army surgeons. How did you write in this interesting character's voice?
That is the question that you sent me earlier, which I have most difficulty answering. I think the answer is that I am a kind of Zelig writer. You've seen the Woody Allen movie, Zelig?
Yes.
Yes, I think I'm a sort of Zelig writer. I don't have a personality of my own. I take on other writers' characteristics. May not be entirely true. There are certain tricks that Arthur Conan Doyle employed when creating Watson. The use of many speech tags. Instead of just said, you've got cried, shouted, replied, answered, retorted. You even have ejaculated in a couple of places, believe it or not. I thought that would get a laugh out of you. But so that's one little trick of the thing. He uses many more adverbs than are used nowadays. He also inverts speech. So you have things like inversion of subject and verb. Amazing, said I. Elementary, said Holmes. That kind of thing. And there is a certain rhythm to the Victorian speech. Now, one thing is that I started writing all these Sherlock Holmes stories when I was in Japan. And it was easier for me to write in a 19th century voice than it would be to write in a contemporary British voice, because I was way, way out of touch with British vocabulary, British society, etc. I'd been by the time I left Japan, I'd lived there for 28 years. When I left the UK, a mobile was something that you stuck on a kid's ceiling. It wasn't a cellular phone. Text was a noun, not a verb. That kind of thing. I was totally out of touch with the mobile phone culture in this country. Many, many other things. I just had no idea what was going on. Pop culture, I could not tell you the name of a single song by Coldplay, believe it or not. Not that I'm uninterested in pop music, but they just never crossed my path.
Right. You're totally immersed in a completely different culture for so long.
That's right. So it was easier for me to go back in time than it was to cross the oceans.
That's nice. Yeah. The only other person that Holmes gets close to is his brother Mycroft. And you wrote an interesting story from the deed box called The Odessa Business that includes more about Sherlock's family, including a younger sister. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Oh, yes. It was hilarious. I went round to a friend's house for dinner in Japan. And after dinner, he and his daughters and I started playing Cluedo. I think you call it Clue in America, don't you? You know, Colonel Mustard in the library with the candlestick.
I love that.
Clue.
I grew up with it.
Well, we started playing this, and at one point I said something like, everyone knows about Sherlock Holmes's smarter older brother. What if he had a smarter younger sister? So I went away and wrote it the next day.
Good.
So I wrote The Odessa Business the next day, and I put it up on Smashwords. I don't know if you know Smashwords, but it's a place to self-publish ebooks. And it got, quite a few people liking it. And so I wrote another one, and the next one I wrote was the Missing Matchbox, which is, I quote from memory here, the story of Isidora Persano, the well-known duelist and journalist who was found stark staring mad with a matchbox on the table in front of him containing a remarkable worm said to be unknown to science.
Wow.
I mean, isn't that a wonderful, wonderful beginning to a story?
I'm hooked.
I'm hooked
Yeah,
too.
I mean, so that's what Conan Doyle wrote. My job, my mission, Jim, should you decide to accept it, was to turn that into a story.
Ah.
So I wrote that and I put that up on Smashwords. And then I was talking to my current publisher, Ink and Beans Press of California, who I've got to say at this point, I've got to give Joe and all the beans at Ink and Beans credit for encouraging me, helping me, making me whatever kind of success I am at the moment. All credit to Joe, who is a lovely person and has been most encouraging. But I was talking to her about publishing another thing, my Japanese stories. But she saw these two stories and said, if you write another Sherlock Holmes story, we'll put it out as one volume. So I did. And we ended up with the book in print as a paperback in Amazon by the end of January. And I'd started writing the first one on the 3rd of January.
Wow.
Amazing.
That's fantastic.
So that I think shows you how important it is for an author to do business with a small publisher. Because I've got friends who have got publishing deals with big publishers, and they may sell more books, but they're waiting 18 months from submitting to their manuscript to getting the first proofs.
Wow,
So I think if you're an author and you want to be published as opposed to publish yourself, then go for a small, energetic, helpful publisher where you're a person and not just a number on a balance sheet.
that sounds like very good advice.
Okay, anyway, that's how Evadne came to be Sherlock Holmes's smarter younger sister.
I love her. Well, George Bernard Shaw once described Holmes as a drug addict without a single amiable trait. So how do you balance your narrator Watson's point of view about Holmes with some of Holmes's character realities?
Okay, I think that Shaw was being very, very unfair to Holmes. He wasn't a drug addict. He occasionally injected himself with the 7% solution, and Watson weaned him off it. So to call him a drug addict is pushing things a bit far, I think. Without a single amiable trait, he had lots of amiable traits. He could be incredibly generous when he chose, with money or his time. My fees never vary, save in the case when I remit them entirely. In other words, he was prepared to take on a case for its own sake. He didn't do everything for money. He had a sense of honour, a deep sense of honour, which shows in all kinds of stories. The Solitary Cyclist, for example. The Three Garridebs, where Watson gets shot, and there is real love. I'm not saying that they were gay or anything, but there is real love in Holmes's reaction to this. He didn't have... I'm sure didn't know what he was talking about, quite frankly. Maybe he was jealous because he couldn't write detective stories. I don't know.
Probably.
It's quite possible. I think Watson has a fairly good view of Holmes. He knows that Holmes is desperately untidy and chaotic in externals and incredibly organised and very, very almost obsessive in his internal mind. I think Watson gives a fairly balanced picture of Holmes. Holmes has got his flaws. He's an infuriating person to live with, but at the same time, one of the most rewarding people, the wisest and best man I ever knew, as is described in The Final Problem.
I'm so glad to hear a nice defense of Sherlock Holmes, really. That's great. Arthur Conan Doyle was quoted as saying that Sherlock Holmes can be sometimes more of a burden than an asset because he as an author, was frustrated with that his other writings didn't reach the same public acclaim. But Hugh, you've very successfully ventured into other books, including Tales of Old Japanese, the older generations living in contemporary Tokyo, and also several thrillers. What are your observations about your experiences as an author switching to different types of books?
Oh, I mean, if I met Sir Arthur Conan Doyle now, I'd say, hey, Arthur, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I agree. I am known as a Sherlock Holmes author. My other books don't do as well as the Sherlock Holmes books. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a number of different things. His Professor Challenger stories basically anticipate Michael Crichton. Michael Crichton ripped off a lot of the ideas from Arthur Conan Doyle. He wrote historical novels, Sir Nigel and The White Company, which are sort of, I'd say, sub-Sir Walter Scott. They're not as good as Arthur Conan Doyle thought they were, I think. I mean, they're enjoyable, but they're not great literature or anything like that. He wrote various other contemporary thrillers, which are, perfectly readable. They're better than Edgar Wallace anyway, put it that way. And he also wrote, for my mind, some of the best stuff he ever wrote is something called the Brigadier Gérard stories, which are the stories of a French Napoleonic cavalry officer, told in the first person. Now, this man is a complete egotistical prat. He really, he believes himself to be the most handsome, the bravest, the best soldier that the emperor has ever had in his army. In fact, he's a complete idiot. But he is so self-absorbed that he doesn't realise this. And it's all told in the first person. And it's phenomenally skillful to be able to write about a character like this, who believes in himself so entirely. But as soon as you read him as an author, as a reader, you realise this man is out to lunch. And I do heartily recommend these if you can get hold of them. They're available on sort of Gutenberg and so on because they're out of copyright. So yeah,
that does sound intriguing.
It does. It does.
But I do sympathise with Sir Arthur on this one. Yeah, I mean, he killed off Sherlock Holmes, obviously, and he had to bring him back to life by popular demand.
Right.
So yeah, he has my sympathy. Sherlock Holmes is an immensely appealing character for whatever reason, and if you get, I mean, I do enjoy writing Sherlock Holmes stories. Don't get me wrong,
Right.
but it would be very nice if people would buy my other books and read them and say nice things about them as well.
Well, speaking of one of them, your thriller Leo's Luck has lots of exciting elements that enhance the atmosphere of it. The high finance embezzlement, rock band lifestyle of the killer rabbits. I love that. You've got some paranormal. You got the Tokyo scene, which is very exotic for me, and some romance. So can you talk a little about writing to so vividly combine such a dynamic mix?
Oh, it's all personal experience. No, it's not.
Now I'm getting nervous.
No. However, it's all extrapolated from personal experience, actually. High finance embezzlement. I have worked in banks. I still actually do some work for a Japanese bank on the compliance and audit side. So yeah, I know a bit about the banking industry. I know a bit about criminality in high places, or banking places anyway. So that's the high finance embezzlement. No, I've never been in a major rock band, but I've played enough as a student, and afterwards I've played enough in rock bands to, know the difference between a Telecaster and a Stratocaster, for example. The paranormal, that is interesting, because I have had some brushes with parapsychology, the experimental laboratory parapsychology, in my time, and so all the paranormal based in the Leo's Luck is based on that. Tokyo, of course, is first person experience.
Beautiful.
So I can say that all of Leo's Luck is, if it's not direct personal experience, at least it is based on things I know about.
That's probably that's probably what makes it so captivating.
Well, I'm glad you enjoy it, because it was enormous fun to write.
Yeah.
I had no idea when I started how it was going to progress, quite frankly.
Yeah.
I started off writing the opening scene with the man walking out on his wife and then discovering his girlfriend in bed with another man. And then from there, I had no idea where it was going to go.
So that brings up a good question, Hugh. Are you a plotter? It sounds like you're not a plotter, that you're more of a seat of the pants writer, that you just, the inspiration strikes you and you go with it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I start off a Sherlock Holmes story and I have no idea, sometimes even what the crime's going to be.
Ah, okay.
So I'm lucky. I've got a very kind of cinematic imagination. And I see the characters in my mind's eye. I've just finished writing a Sherlock Holmes story, actually, just about an hour before we started this interview.
Oh, my goodness.
And I have a very, very clear mental image of where the people are standing when they're talking, even. I can see the room in my mind's eye. So basically what I'm doing, I'm winding up the characters and listening to what they say. And sometimes I have the crime, there is the dead body, or there is the abstracted object or something like that, and I don't know who's done it. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'll wake up and I'll say, oh, that's what happened.
You're really living your stories.
Oh, yes. Oh, very much so. They're not coldly calculated at all. They're very emotional in a way, even though Sherlock Holmes is, the cold, calculating voice of reason. The stories themselves are, very much an emotional experience to write in many cases.
Which I think is what makes your writing so captivating.
Well, thank you.
I have a question for you. Your website, which is 221 Beanbaker Street, describes your Sherlockian books as the most authentic pastiches yet published. And I looked up pastiche to remind myself what it actually meant, and it said it's defined as a work of art or literature that imitates the work of one or more other artists, and celebrates rather than parodies the work it imitates. So when you write, do you see your work as a pastiche, or are you truly channeling the spirit of Dr. Watson?
Okay, when I first heard the word pastiche applied to my Sherlock Holmes stories, I was rather annoyed. Because I felt that pastiche is something second-rate. It's an imitation. However, then I learnt that in the Sherlockian world, pastiche is the technical term applied to stories of Sherlock Holmes. So, yeah, my works are pastiches in the Sherlockian sense. It doesn't mean they are imitations in a way, but I try to make them as authentic as possible. And the authenticity actually extends in the printed versions to try and duplicating the typography, late 19th century typography, which is slightly different. You put hair spaces between opening quotes and the opening words of a sentence. Semicolons are separated from the text by spaces on either side, that kind of thing. So even down to that kind of level, I try to reproduce that kind of authenticity.
All right. I think often people hear the word pastiche and they associate it with something negative, and really it's more of a neutral term. Right.
That's what I felt when I first heard the word, and I was a little insulted that someone would describe my work as pastiche. But as I say, in the Sherlockian world, it's a technical term, meaning a Sherlock Holmes story written by someone other than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It
should be viewed more as an honorable sign that you've really done your homework and you love what you're writing about, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think Wendy touched on this already, but I have sort of wanted to drill down into this as well. How do you get into the mindset when you sit down to write one of these stories? You're writing as a late 19th century physician detective, and you've talked about the punctuation, the typography. I know there are some writers that actually, when they're writing a historical novel, for example, sit down and surround themselves with the music and the art and the food and perhaps even perfumes of that era. Do you get involved to that degree or not?
No, I can actually listen to you two and write a Sherlock Holmes story, believe it or not.
I'll take that as being an inspiration for you.
That's great.
Yeah.
Right.
How do I think in a 19th century voice? I really don't know. I mean, perhaps I am sort of in some way channeling some kind of 19th century. I don't know. It's imitation. I think I am just a good imitator. I mean, I've written a couple of 19th century science fiction books, The Untime and The Untime Revisited, and those are written in a 19th century voice, but I wrote them as if they had been translated from the French, because they're set in Paris, and the first person narrator is a Frenchman. So I actually wrote them, in many cases, as if they had been translated from the French. And in some cases, I actually thought of what I wanted to say in French, and then translated it in my head and put it into English.
Because there is a very different way that people whose native language is different than English put words together, even if they're working in English. So
that's right. I mean, there's one point where I get the protagonist to say no, and 1,000 times no, which sounds a bit silly in English, but if you say it in French, non, et mille fois non, it sounds much better.
Right, truly. Fascinating.
Anyway, that was fun, and again, I went with the typography there, and we set the book in a French 19th century typeface.
I love that. I'm going to have to go back and look at some of your stories more closely, perhaps, and look at all the punctuation.
Well, I mean, these are things which I don't really expect people to notice consciously, but I think they add to the atmosphere.
I'd absolutely agree. I'd absolutely agree. Another question for you, Hugh. I know that there are rabid Sherlock Holmes fans around the world, and there are many, I'm not sure if they're called Sherlockian or Holmesian societies in
Depends
various
if you're
places.
American or British, by the way.
Ah, okay.
Sherlockian is the American term. Holmesian is the more British term.
All right. Okay. So there are lots of these groups. Do you interact with them or speak with them or take part in their events?
Yeah, I'm a member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, whose previous chairman actually was at college with me. We were in the same year at college.
Ah.
And as it happens, another member of the college at the same time has written the autobiography of Sherlock Holmes, Nick Renison. So Jonathan McCafferty, Nick Renison and I all have made our mark in the Sherlockian or Holmesian world. And we're all at the same college, very small college. I mean, I think there are about 120, 130 people in our year. And we've all made our mark in the Holmesian world. None of the three of us, as far as I can remember, was particularly interested in Sherlock Holmes at that, not as an obsession or anything. So that's rather unusual. And the college magazine actually ran an article on us called The Three Students, which of course is the title of one of the Sherlock Holmes adventures. So that was quite fun. Yeah, so the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. I'm also a member of the Watsonian Society, which concentrates on John H. Watson rather than Sherlock Holmes. And I've written articles for the Baker Street Journal, which is the American Sherlock, one of the American Sherlock Holmes Society's journals. I was also a member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of Japan, but all the meetings and so on took place in Japanese, and my Japanese is okay, but it's rather exhausting, and of course I couldn't read the material terribly well that they put out, so I dropped that, I'm afraid. But yes, Sherlock Holmes is a big thing in Japan, and I do have Japanese fans whose English is better than my Japanese.
Great. Well, I didn't know there were actually groups devoted to Watson, and I think he deserves equal time, certainly. So.
Oh, definitely. I mean, he's a wonderful character. I mean, I'm very fond of John Watson.
I am too. Now, I know you've also not only written the Sherlock Holmes stories, but you've also gone and written something called Sherlock Ferret, a series written for children.
Oh, yes.
And that you worked with a very gifted illustrator, Andy Berger. I believe that's how you pronounce his name.
Berger, yes.
Berger. How did this direction toward children's fiction come about?
Okay, Andy is a Facebook friend, a great illustrator. If you go to Andy Berger's page, you will see all his pictures. He does lovely pictures of animals, little children. Is a lovely guy, and he also keeps ferrets. Well, one ferret at a time. But he loves ferrets, and I was saying, do you think you could do a picture of a ferret playing a violin?
Why not?
So he did. And I said, okay, this is Sherlock Ferret. If I write the story for kids, can you illustrate it? He said, okay. So we did. And we sold this idea to Joe at Ink and Beans. And we've just finished our fourth, which is Sherlock Ferret and the Phantom Photographer. And they're aimed at 7 to 10-year-olds to read themselves. Younger kids would probably enjoy them if they had them read to them. We try to introduce a little bit of vocabulary. We're not making them overly preachy. They are genuine detective stories. Sherlock Ferret and his friend Watson Mouse live under Mrs. Hudson's bakery, and they exist on the cake crumbs that Mrs. Hudson drops. And they have a friend who is called Lestrade, who is a rhinoceros, but not a very big one. and they fight the evil Moriarty magpie.
I love that. That is fantastic.
Makes perfect sense.
Fantastic.
So they've got their own little world. They're very moral little beasts. They have their own code of honor. And Sherlock Ferret, like Sherlock Holmes, is a rather annoying character to live with, but essentially good-hearted. And we have great fun with these. So, as I say, we're now on our fourth. We started off with the missing necklace, and then we had Sherlock Holmes and the multiplying masterpieces, which involves art fraud, and it involves such lovely characters as Pablo Picasso. That's Picasso, P-I-G. And Vincent van Gogh, and Barbara Hippoworth. So we had some lovely characters there.
Oh,
That sounds like so much fun.
Would you like to hear of some of the latest one?
Definitely.
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
Okay, well, this is, as I say, Sherlock Ferret and the Phantom Photographer. And this is chapter 2. Mr. Montague Mole has just called on Sherlock Ferret, and he's talking about some rather threatening letters and photographs which have arrived through his letterbox, and he has no idea who has sent them, and he's just read out the threatening letter. So Watson Mouse tells the stories just as Watson tells the stories in Sherlock Holmes. The room was very warm, but I shivered. Even Sherlock Ferret seemed alarmed as he looked at the note. I can understand why you do not want to show this to your wife, he said. Do these letters come with all the photographs? Mr. Montague Mole nodded. Yes, there have been 9 of these so far. Sherlock Ferret curled himself up in his chair and closed his eyes, the way he often does when he's thinking about a difficult problem. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Well, it would have been silence if Mr. Montague Mole had not been drinking his tea. I've never known anyone to make so much noise drinking tea. You know what it sounds like when the last of the water from a basin goes down the plug hole? Well, Mr. Montague Mole drinking tea sounded a bit like that, but much, much louder. It could be Moriarty Magpie at the bottom of all this enigmatic business, said Sherlock Ferret. Or it might be someone else, of course. But my question to you, Mr. Montague Mole, is why would anyone want to send you such messages? What is an enigmatic business, Mr. Sherlock Ferret? Asked Mr. Montague Mole. I was glad he'd asked that question because I wanted to know the answer myself. Enigmatic is the word. It simply means that it is strange and mysterious. Why couldn't you say that? Mr. Montague Mole complained. I didn't mind too much, though. I learn lots of new words from Sherlock Ferret, and he learns them from all the big books on the shelves in our rooms. Sometimes I don't seem to learn them properly, though, like the insulting detective business. That's one I always get wrong. But answering your question why anyone would send such messages to me and my family, I don't know, Mr. Montague Mole continued. We're a very quiet family. We moles only go out at night. We only eat worms and insects. Not butterflies, I hope, Sherlock Ferret interrupted him. Sherlock Ferret loves butterflies, and he would be very upset if anyone tried to eat them. Certainly not, exclaimed Mr. Montague Mole. At my age and with my figure, I have better things to do than waste my time trying to catch butterflies to eat. And I'm sure that the wings would give me indigestion with all their bright colours and everything. As I was saying, though, we're a very quiet family. We make molehills, of course, like all moles do, but we're very careful where we make them. My 3rd youngest, Mortimer, once made a molehill in the middle of a golf course. I made sure that he didn't have any fresh worms for a week. Not having any fresh worms for a week doesn't sound like a terrible sort of punishment to me, but then I'm not a mole, so it would be a bit different, I suppose. So there's no one who'd want to do you or your family any harm? I can't think of anyone. And how long have you lived where you're living now? 7 or 8 years. No, perhaps 9, because Minnie, she's the 8th youngest and the cleverest of them all, in my opinion. She's now 8 years old. She was born after we moved. Let's say 9 years. Did you dig your hole yourself? Oh, good gracious, no. Where would I find the time? No, it was a hole that was left by a very old friend of mine, and when he moved away from the area, he said I could take his hole for my family. I've extended it a bit in places, though. There's a worm store here and there, in case anyone wakes up and feels hungry, and a few beetle traps for those who fancy that kind of light snack, and extra bedrooms for the children, of course. What was the name of your old friend? Mr. Montague Mole took off his thick glasses and scratched his head. Do you know, It was such a long time ago that I really cannot remember his name. Was he a mole? I asked, trying to be helpful. Oh, yes, he was. Oh, no, perhaps not. How forgetful of me. I'm sure you will remember, Sherlock Ferret told him, and sneezed 3 times, which is usually a sign that he's bored and wants to do something else. Sounds very interesting, though. Perhaps you'll leave these photographs and the letter with me. Call back next week and I'll let you know what I've discovered. Thank you, said Mr. Montague Mole as he left us. So
Very
that's
nice.
Lovely.
So there's all kinds of things there. There are various running things which go through. Sherlock Ferret learns a lot from his big books, and he has big books about everything. He's even got a big book of poo, but that's rather nasty. And Watson Mouse doesn't like to look at that one.
I think what I enjoy most about that, not only in addition to hearing your lovely accent as you read your work, but is the fact that the way the book is written, you don't talk down to children.
Oh, certainly not. No. I am writing for adults who maybe don't have quite the vocabulary that a full adult will have. But yeah, I'm not talking down to them at all. This is a mystery story. And they've got to solve the mystery for themselves before Sherlock Ferret does.
I think anytime you can encourage children to think, it's a very good thing indeed.
So I'm very pleased with these, and I don't regard them as being lighter work any more than I think Rudyard Kipling regarded the Just So stories as being lighter works than, or his Jungle Book as being any lighter than his adult work. I think, actually, my Sherlock Ferret owes a little bit to Rudyard Kipling and the Just So stories, the repetition of things. So, for instance, The Phantom Photographer relies quite a lot on, one of the plot elements, rather, is treasure. And it's never just called treasure. It's always gold and silver and rubies and diamonds. Mm. And that's repeated every time. Mm-hmm. That phrase. So someone starts saying gold, and the kids join in, and silver and rubies and diamonds every time.
Beautiful.
So there's repetition there. Same with Lestrade, who is a rhinoceros, but not a very big one. But is always a rhinoceros, but not a very big one.
That's a great comparison.
Makes it memorable as well.
Yes. One of the most interesting pictures that I once asked Andy to draw, and it's a two-way thing, by the way. Andy sometimes comes up with a picture which sends the plot off in a different direction. Sometimes the plot forces Andy to draw a particular picture. But the picture that I asked Andy, do you think you could draw a rhinoceros giving a sloth a piggyback ride? And he did. So if you read Sherlock Ferret and the Poisoned Pond, you will find Lestrade, who is a rhinoceros, though not a very big one, giving a piggyback ride to Dr. Solomon Sloth.
Very nice.
I'm going to have to look for that, for sure. Hugh, anything else about current projects you're working on, or if you'd like to let our listeners know what your website is, how they can find you online?
Oh, I'm all over the place. Actually, I mean, just Google my name, and if you see Sherlock Holmes and so on, you will Sherlock Holmes and Hugh Ashton together. You'll find me. I have HughAshtonBooks.info. You mentioned 221 Bean Baker Street.info. I have a Facebook page. Several of my books have their own pages as well. There's the Boxes of John H. Watson, MD, which is a sort of books page on Facebook. I also have my Hugh Ashton brackets books, which is a books page. I'm Hugh Ashton, one word, no punctuation, on Twitter. But the Twitter tends to be, I'm afraid, just advertising. It tends not to be my personal views. Sometimes you'll find something personal, but for the most part, it's just keeping my name and the titles and the links in front of the public. And plans and what I'm working on at the moment. Well, I just said I've just finished another Sherlock Holmes story. Where that will end up, it may end up in the MX collection of the next MX collection. MX is Steve MX of London, and has got this wonderful idea of producing a whole load of pastiches by different authors, putting them together in a book, edited by David Markham, who is an American Sherlockian who lives in, I think it's Tennessee he lives. And these books are big, they're heavy, and they've got a whole load of stories in, of new Sherlock Holmes stories. The wonderful thing about these books is that all the profits go not to the authors or to the publishers, but they go to Stepping Stones, which is a school for children with special needs, which is now based in Undershaw, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's old house down in Sussex.
Oh.
So a lot of authors, a lot of Sherlock Holmes authors, including myself, are giving their stories to help these children and to help make Undershaw back into Sir Arthur's home once again as far as possible.
That's really wonderful.
That is.
So that's one thing I'm doing. I'm working on a number of different things simultaneously, some of which may actually come to fruition, some may not. I've started something which might even end up being a romance. I don't know. I've never written a Harlequin or a Mills and Boon. I think it's very, very difficult to do. So I may just give up on this one. The other thing I am doing, by the way, and here I'm going to blow my own trumpet a bit, is do some editing and some book production work for people who have got so far with the book but want to go a little further. And my catchphrase for this is helping turn your idea into a book. So I don't want to be a publisher, but I do want to help people find the right publisher with a finished product. So that could be editing, it could be proofreading, it could be typesetting, it could be research, it could even be ghostwriting. I've done ghostwriting in my time for a number of people. So it could be any one of those things, but basically you've got an idea, you think it would make a good book, you're not quite sure how to go about it, or you lack the particular skills to do a certain part of the process. Okay, who are you going to call? And the answer is me.
Nice.
Wonderful. Have you ever done any screenwriting?
I haven't. One or two of my things actually I think would make good screen stuff. Leo's luck, I've got a independent film producer in Tokyo who thinks he could make a nice low budget, well, I don't know how low budget, but a nice version of Leo. And if he can come up with things, then my publisher and I are definitely willing to talk to him. The first book I ever published is called Beneath Grey Skies, and that's an alternate history, which I think would make a great TV miniseries. It's too complex to be made into a 90-minute or a 2-hour movie. But I think as a miniseries with say 4 or 5 90-minute episodes, there's enough meat in the sandwich there to make it worthwhile. I'd love someone to turn it into a TV miniseries. I don't know if you know CSA by Kevin Wilmot. It's a mockumentary, and it's what would happen if the Confederacy had won the American Civil War. It's very good. It's very well done indeed. But anyway, I wrote to Kevin Wilmot, who produced this, and said, would you be interested in this? And gave him a brief outline. He said, I'd be fascinated, but I have no money.
Oh, dear. Oh, dear.
Yes.
Well,
Which is
thank you.
always the way, isn't it?
Yes.
Always.
But yes, I mean, one thing about this year, it's been a very busy year, getting ready to move and then moving and then settling into a new country. My wife is Japanese, and there's a lot to do when you're moving into another country. So my output hasn't been so good this year. I think I've only produced 2 books, maybe 3 books this year.
You're such a slacker.
Well, I feel like it sometimes, actually. But yeah, I'm now getting back into the rhythm of writing. I typically write very fast anyway. My record is a whole 9,000 word Sherlock Holmes adventure in a day.
My
That's my
goodness,
record.
that's amazing.
That is a record.
That's quite amazing. Well, we'll move on to our next segment, and I have just started on Robert McKee's book called Story, which is about substance, structure, style, and the principles of screenwriting, hence my question to Hugh about, have you ever tackled screenwriting? It's a truly brilliant book, and this got me thinking about stories and storytelling and the power of story, and especially history. I'd be remiss in not mentioning that today is December 7th, which is the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, a date that shall live in infamy, as one very famous man put it. And to put it in perspective, for the greatest generation, of which my parents were a part, this date was their 9/11, truly a defining moment for their generation. And according to some news broadcasts, there will be a few very senior U.S. vets returning to Pearl for the first time, the very first time since 1941.
Well,
And given their ages, I think most of them are in their 90s, some of them are over 100 years old. This is probably their last opportunity to spend time there remembering the events. And so on this day, I'm thinking of my mother's youngest brother, David, who was an 18-year-old sailor on one of those ships at Pearl Harbor, and the things that he saw and experienced there, things which certainly changed his outlook on life forever. And I'm also remembering the stories that he told many, many years later to us as young people. And so I've got to say, reading and certainly the power of story is something which in a more peaceable way can really change your outlook on life as well, by taking you places you could never visit, dropping you into a distant era, or exposing you to a controversial viewpoint or a culture that you've always wondered about. So for my segment today, I'm expressing gratitude for all the authors and their books across many genres that I've read this year, and they are books which have opened my eyes and allowed me to see a broader horizon. And I'll turn it over to Wendy.
Thanks, Julie. Well, I recently enjoyed a wonderful visit to the International Exhibition of Sherlock Holmes, which is sort of what got us started with this whole interest in doing a podcast on the topic. It was recently in Seattle. Actually, it's still here until January at the Pacific Science Center, a traveling exhibit that I really encourage you to look for. You'll get to try your hand at solving a murder scene. So when I saw that, of course, the cozy sleuth in me couldn't wait to grab my little clue book and start documenting the data.
I can just see you.
I was observing crime scenes from all sides. At least I was trying to observe and not just look at them. And also from all suspects. I was studying the mock blood splatter displays to determine angles of entry. I was pushing and pulling the dead weight through the sand to distinguish different types of tracks. I was studying chemicals and poisonous plants. After all, as he said, once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. So... Yes. Well, Hugh, I'm sorry to report that what remained for this cozy sleuth was not the truth for this case, because if it had been up... No. Well, I tried, but if it had been up to me, the wrong suspect would have been hauled off in the paddy wagon.
Oh. Oh, dear.
But what a good time I had sleuthing, and I gained an additional appreciation for how difficult it is to solve a murder, not just when you're reading about it. So I also really enjoyed the exhibits of the first edition books and the photos and letters, because also I hadn't seen a picture before of Dr. Joseph Bell, and that's...
Oh, yes.
You're familiar with him, Hugh.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Well, Arthur Conan Doyle interned for him, and he attributed him as the main influence for Sherlock Holmes. And I really didn't know much about Dr. Bell prior to the exhibit, but the pictures included him smoking a pipe in the checkered hat and cloak that are familiar sights to a lot of Holmes fans. Dr. Bell was very interesting as well. He lectured at the University of Edinburgh and advocated for active observation, not just seeing. And he was good about, for example, guessing a person's possible occupation, like a cobbler, based on where the worn patch is on a person's trousers.
Yes, in many ways, he was very, very like the House character, wasn't he? Hugh Grant character.
Oh, the television show, yes.
Yes, yes.
I never thought of that. You're right. Yeah. Yeah. And he was a pioneer in forensic science, and he was often called upon to assist the police in their cases. So I was interested in all that. And I was interested in a little document about what the tools were that the police were given in the 1890s. They were given a baton, a noise-making rattle to raise the alarm. They had handcuffs, which were called darbies, a lantern, a metal whistle, a waterproof cloth cape, and leggings. And with that, the game was afoot.
Yes. I give Holmes a whistle, a police whistle, all the time. I also give him his loaded riding crop.
Oh.
I don't give him a revolver. I let Watson carry the revolver all the time, but Watson hardly ever uses it. It's more used as a threat.
Yes. Well, anyways, I really enjoyed the exhibition, so I do recommend it. And I do have a book recommendation as well, so I'm going to go ahead and go with that. And in keeping with a sleuth's respect for the art of observation and rationale, my recommendation today, in addition to all Sherlock Holmes stories, which I love, is a cozy mystery series, which is the Father Brown books by G.K. Chesterton. You know those, Hugh?
Oh, of course. I mean, I would love to be able to write a Father Brown pastiche.
He's so brilliant.
The last the Sherlock Holmes story I've just finished was in grave danger of turning into a Father Brown story, but with Sherlock Holmes as the detective rather than Father Brown, and with Arthur Conan Doyle writing it rather than G.K. Chesterton. But it was in grave danger of falling into the... I mean, I love Father Brown. It's extremely skillfully done. The style is absolutely wonderful. And the little moral twists and the paradoxes and the little epigrams that Chesterton slips in there are absolutely superb.
I agree. I just can't get enough.
There are pieces of real poetry in G.K. Chesterton.
Truly.
I don't know if you know the one, I think it's called The Invisible Man. And it's the one where someone is murdered by a robot of his own invention. I don't know if you know that one.
I don't know that one.
I think it's in The Innocence of Father Brown. I can't remember.
Oh,
but
okay.
There's a scene in that when they are driving through North London, and the way that G.K. Chesterton describes the light on the modern white apartment buildings in that part of North London towards, I think it's Swiss Cottage, that sort of way. It's pure magic. There's pure magic in the way that he's describing that urban scene. And there's also pure magic in part of his country descriptions as well.
Yeah.
It's absolutely lovely. Of course, Father Brown is a great character, and Flambeau is a wonderful foil as well, of course.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, I cannot get enough of both of them. It's just fantastic. And I just love Father Brown's methods. And I like the one explanation he says at one point. He says, "You see, I had murdered them all myself. I had planned out each one of the crimes
That's
very
right. Yes.
carefully."
Yes. That's right. Yes, I remember that. I think
He's
my favourite one is the one about the fish forks.
oh yeah
Do you remember that one?
yes.
I think that's one of my favourites.
I'm going to have to go back and reread some of those because I've forgotten how truly delightful those can be.
Well, and as a cozy, it's just the perfect character because, like the character says himself, has it never struck you that a man who does next to nothing but hear people's real sins is not likely to be wholly unaware of human evil? I mean, it's ideal.
Yes.
Well, I highly recommend the books, and then there's also they've done old films of this, but there's a current BBC series that's also very well done, and
Oh, who's the actor?
that plays Father Brown. Oh boy, now you're testing me. I'm not sure. I can't remember his name, but
I'll have to have a look at that.
I will too.
it's excellent. Yeah, the mysteries happen in that small village in the Cotswolds. And I think that's the key to me for cozy mysteries too, is that they're solved by regular people. You know, they take care of it themselves, and and each of the characters are just so much fun. So that's my recommendation. Hugh and Julie, do you have book recommendations for us?
I've got a recommendation of a book I've just finished reading, which you will never have heard of. It's written by a friend of mine, but I would, even if he wasn't a friend, I would be recommending this very, very highly. I've just given it a 5-star review on Amazon. The author's name is Jim McGrath, and the book is called A Death in Winter, 1963. And I don't know how much it's going to appeal to Americans. It might or it might not. It's a police procedural. It's very film noir. It's set obviously in 1963. In 1963, the UK had a very, very hard winter, and it's set against that backdrop. And it's set in what's called the Black Country. Now, the Black Country is just south of where I am, and it's the industrial Birmingham. And it's the two characters are a probationary constable who's just joined the force, and a more experienced, the smallest policeman in Birmingham. But he's incredibly tough and incredibly resourceful. And they uncover some really evil and nasty goings on, which affect not just Birmingham, but the whole country. And it is superbly done. It's got masses of local colour, which means a lot to me because I'm from this area. And the characters, you've got to love them. The two policemen, they're wonderful. They show all kinds of humanity. They're warm, they're rounded, they're tough when they need to be, they're compassionate when they need to be. And the supporting cast is excellent as well. The plot kept me reading to the end. You knew what was going to happen, but you didn't know how it was going to happen. And that, I think, is the test of a good mystery.
Excellent.
I agree.
So that is A Death in Winter, 1963. I think it's only available as an ebook, but you can certainly get it on Kindle. And I've got it on Kobo, and I think it's available in other ebook formats as well. But highly recommended, Jim McGrath's book.
Great.
Good to
Thank
know.
you.
Good to know. And I have a recommendation as well. Perhaps all this talk about Japan influenced me a little bit. My book that I'm recommending, since I'm a mystery and thriller writer, is Rainstorm by Barry Eisler. That's spelled E-I-S-L-E-R. And it's part of a series featuring anti-hero assassin John Rain, who is a half-Japanese, half-American assassin, which much of this espionage thriller is set in Southeast Asia and Brazil. But relax. Yes, this isn't my normal type of reading either. He only takes assignments on really bad people, such as an arms dealer in Southeast Asia. So other books in the series are Rainfall, which was Barry's first book, Hard Rain, and Killing Rain. It's fast-paced, it's action-packed, as a thriller should be, yet oddly and wonderfully combines amazing cultural details that are richly atmospheric. One newspaper reviewer even suggested his books could be used as travel guides. And the details on high-tech weaponry are amazing as well. Now, this is an action hero who is cliché-free, as far as I can see from my reading. He's a three-dimensional human being instead of a cardboard cutout, so the book never veers into a formulaic pattern, as so many thrillers do. The author spent extensive time living and working in Japan, as Hugh did, and he actually earned a black belt in judo in Tokyo. So the martial arts sequences are very realistic and compelling, even for someone who doesn't practice martial arts. So if you enjoy reading about espionage, weapons, seduction, betrayal, and life and death games in very exotic settings, this is a series for you. And I can really see his books made into some blockbuster films.
Oh, they are being.
Are they now? Okay.
Oh yes. So
Okay.
Barry signed a couple of contracts.
He's
As
really talented.
as you're talking, I'm looking through my bookshelves in this room to find my signed copy of Rainfall.
Ah.
Because Barry and I have exchanged emails, and we've met several times.
Oh, lovely.
As you say, an extremely talented writer indeed. And listening to him speak about his writing methods, as you say, his books could be acting as a guidebook. He walks the streets that John Rain walks. He notices, yes, there is a ramen shop on the left. He notices that the sushi shop on the right has got a blue curtain in front of it, that kind of thing. So as the reviewer says, his Tokyo is very, very accurate indeed.
Wonderful. Since I've never been there, that's always helpful validation, and it's
also, I think if I'm right, Barry himself used to be in the CIA at one time. Now, in what capacity, I don't know, but I believe he was a spook of some kind.
I wouldn't be surprised. I know it does say on his bio that he worked for the government. He also is a Cornell graduate of their College of Law, so obviously a bright fellow. But
very much.
It's unusual in thrillers. It's very rare, I think, and I think Hugh will probably bear this out, that you get this kind of layers of atmosphere and culture, and the setting, has such a strong personality and bearing on the plot. Usually you don't get that in most thrillers, sadly.
True. I tried to do it in one of mine at the Sharp end. That's Sharp with an E, because the hero is called Sharp. Is called Kenneth Sharp. That's another Tokyo thriller. A little less exotic than Barry's, perhaps. And there's another Barry who, and that's Barry Lancet, who has also written Tokyo-based thrillers.
Oh, okay.
There's Japantown. I can't remember them all. Somewhere, again, I've got signed copies of these as well, but they're in the other room. But Barry Lancet has also written Japan-based thrillers, and he's invented a very interesting character, which is not John Rain. My character in my thriller is an accidental hero. He's someone who stumbles into something that is rather too big for him to handle.
I like that. It makes us all think that could maybe happen to us as we're reading along. So
it's funny, no matter what. I mean, we all are mystery lovers, and we love the mystery, but the heart of all of these books really are the characters and how they interact and what those personalities are like. Isn't that true?
Oh, it is true. I've read some very interesting plots in terms of mysteries and thrillers, and I'm bored despite the plot, because the characters don't live. They're just puppets. wooden puppets, and their dialogue is cliched. Unless they speak with a real voice and they move as real people, the best plot in the world isn't going to save that book.
I think that really summarizes it very well. Don't you think, Julie?
I do indeed. Well, I think it's almost time for us to wrap up now. Hugh, are there any parting thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners before we sign off for the day?
What, other than buy my books?
Well, that's always important, but
it's always important. Other than that, no. I mean, it's been great talking with you two, and listening to your view of, what makes a thriller, and your views on, what of Sherlock Holmes. I'm very flattered by all the nice things you've said about me.
All true.
All true.
Can you hear me blushing from where you are?
Just a bit.
Just a bit. But no, thank you very, very much for inviting me on. I mean, I've just seen what the time is, and we've been talking for a long, long time. I mean, I hope it's...
We have.
It just
but
flies,
it's
though.
all been good. It's all been good. Well, our profound thanks, Hugh Ashton, for speaking to us today from the United Kingdom. And we may be far apart, but I think as mystery readers and writers and lovers of mystery, we feel much closer to you. And we will sign off now, Wendy and I, with our exit music, which is my brother Chris Squire's composition, The Man in the Panama Hat. Thanks again, and keep writing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.